Chapter 1 of Things Seen in Venice by Lonsdale and Laura Ragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Things Seen in Venice by Lonsdale Ragg, B.D., Oxon, Prebendary of Buckden in Lincoln Cathedral, author of Dante and His Italy, and Laura M. Ragg, author of The Women Artists of Bologna, with many illustrations. London, Seeley Service and Company Limited, 38 Great Russell Street, 1920. Alla cara amica, Alethea Wheal Lawley. Chapter 1. First Impressions. To be obliged to enter a stately edifice by its back door is an unfortunate circumstance destructive of any just conception of its proportions, grandeur, and charm. Yet this obligation is laid, not only on every pedestrian visitor who calls on the dwellers in Venetian palaces, but on every modern traveller brought by railway to the city of the lagoons. Its visitors of old time were more fortunate. They approached this città nobilissima e singolare by ways which enabled them to taste its quality from afar. They saw its distant campanili as they sailed across the Adriatic from Trieste, or they came, like John Evelyn in 1645, by Brondolo and Chioggia, over against Malamocco, the chief port and anchorage where our English merchantmen lie that trade with Venice. And here, entering the lagoon, they slipped into the Bacino di San Marco, the campanile beckoning them on, till their progress was arrested by the custom house, which looks seaward from the sharp point of Dorsoduro. Or, like Shakespeare's Portia, they might come from Padua, travelling by barge along the Brenta, through the level green water meadows to Fusina, and there embarking on the common ferry which trades to Venice, they approached the city by the broad Giudecca channel. Or again, if they had crossed the Alps by the Brenner Pass, they left their carriages and all the toils and fatigues of travel at Mestre, and there entered a gondola, the reviving salt breeze and the masses of heaving seaweed proclaiming the vicinity of the Adriatic. Then they rowed across the lagoon, slowly nearing the city, which lay like a big lotus leaf on its bosom, not surrounded, like other medieval towns, by defences of masonry, but having these shining expanses of water alike for road and rampart. And when the low shore of the mainland behind them had become a mere wavering, neutral-tinted line, the boat swept into the Canal of Canareggio, and then past the church of San Geremia into the Grand Canal, the broadest and most stately street in Europe. Yet what the modern traveller loses in aesthetic satisfaction, he gains in sensations of astonishment. No previous preparation, descriptive or photographic, can seriously diminish the delightful thrill experienced by the newcomer to Venice as he leaves the railway platform and emerges on the station quay overlooking the Grand Canal. There, by the broad flight of water steps, the cabs of Venice, the hired gondolas, are waiting in a black mass for the arrival of the express trains. As soon as the first luggage-laden figure appears on the quay, the mass becomes agitated. The air is rent with cries. The offering, "Gondola, gondola," from the water. From the shore, the imperative, "Poppe, poppe," boatmen, of blue-vested facchini, anxious to secure a good boat for the signori who have tipped them well. Or the Christian name of some private gondolier, "Francesco, Luigi, Pietro," or what not, is shouted, and a reassuring "Eccomi, signorina, pronto, signore," comes from some stalwart standing form, who presently, with marvellous dexterity, will manage to extricate his gondola from the crowd, avoid the wash of a steamer making for the station pontoon to the left, and draw up at some spot on the outskirts of confusion. Many of the best hotels now send a steam launch as station bus to meet expected guests. This is an advantage to the traveller who is going for the bathing season straight out to the Lido. Otherwise time seems dearly gained at the expense of the restful motion of the old-fashioned gondola, one of the most characteristic and delicious features of life in the lagoons. To arrive uncertain of one's destination, and without the power to conceal the fact beneath a mask of assumed decision, is to be the victim of the knot of hotel porters who command the station exit, chanting the names of their houses, prepared to pounce like spiders on any vacillating fly. Happy is the man who has come to stay in Venice with some of its residents, and is met on arrival by his host's private gondola, manned by 2 gondoliers. Happier still is he if his friends refrain from coming to welcome him in person. To feel oneself propelled with the easy speed of the double oar, to observe without fully comprehending, to yield oneself silently to wholly new sensations — this is the way to enjoy to the full the luxury of arrival. Travellers who have crossed the Alps often come by an express train from Milan, which reaches Venice near midnight. Those who have crossed the Apennines often enter with the dawn. Both hours are favourable to striking first impressions. As the night train leaves the station at Mestre and steams across the bridge built by the Austrians to link their conquest with the mainland, the lights of Venice gleam brightly in the midst of a plain dark water, and the unique situation of the City of Refuge is realized more vividly than when the eye is dazzled by sunlight and distracted by the unending variations of cloud and reflection. Then, when the restful gondola is reached, and the traveller begins to move along the waterway, he is penetrated by the novelty of its silence. In the darkness he strains his ears rather than his eyes, and the only sounds which meet them are the rhythmical dip of the oar, the lapping of the tide against marble steps, the weirdly melodious cry of the gondolier sent forth in warning as he rounds a corner or overtakes another boat. Residents in Venice know that the stillness is fallacious. Experience quickly teaches that human voices echo through the silence made by the absence of traffic, that narrow foot passages and waterways are funnels up which sounds of steps or of revellers' songs ascend to upper windows, that Italians seem able to reduce the hours of sleep to a minimum, that when wine shops disgorge their cheerful occupants, vivacious discussion will continue on the nearest bridge, that solitary wayfarers are apt to enliven a night tramp with reproductions, allegro and con brio, of the popular operatic tune, and finally that certain gondoliers are bound by the laws of the Municipio to be on duty all night at the traghetti ferries, and are determined that some of the inhabitants of the surrounding houses shall share their vigil. But the traveller is still ignorant of these facts, though he may discover some of them all too soon when he retires weary to his couch. For the moment this quiet water transit possesses him, this arrival, so unlike the drive from the station in any other city, seaport or country village. He plunges wondering into the dim side canals, scarcely able to discern the outline of the masonry through the shadow of which he passes, all that is mean and ugly hidden by the darkness, and mystery adding allurement to the beauty half revealed. Then he emerges again into the moonlight space of the Grand Canal with its bordering of stately palaces. Some are shuttered and lightless, and the gondola of the house, sparecchiata, despoiled of all but its frame, heaves fastened to its pali, the tall posts before the door. Others have no gondola, while a single light is burning in the water entrance, indications that the owners are still abroad and are expected home anon. Or again, there is a long row of lighted windows, from which issue gusts of laughter, merriment and music, while below a black group of gondolas lies awaiting the close of an evening reception. Then, if the traveller is bound for one of the hotels near St. Mark's, there will intervene another short cut, another sudden plunge into a side canal, till finally he emerges into a great stretch of scintillating moon-swept water, giving back the lights of the Piazzetta and widening seaward to the shimmering lagoon. But if the traveller come when the shadows are slipping downwards from the palaces like a discarded garment sliding to the feet, and the expanse of lagoon and wide channel are growing grey and faintly luminous, he will find a quieter station, a less confused embarkation, and a more refreshing breeze than at any other hour. Then, too, he will have glimpses of the city's provisioning, invisible to later risers, of barges bearing milk from the mainland, of boats laden with market garden produce, of a bustle accompanied by the sound of many voices, about the Rialto and the fish market. Then, too, if the weather favour him, he will see two sights of magical loveliness. Looking seawards, the dome of the church of the Madonna della Salute, with all its delicate barocco twirls and spirals, a wondrous brittle dome of wizardry, outlined against a sky whose pale intensifying light is veiled in a transparent pearly haze. Looking landwards, the whole line of the Alps, white crested with a sprinkling of newly fallen snow, or gleaming in silver and pale purple through the tremulous white of a summer dawn. The sunset may show them again, revealing more clearly to the west the mountains above Vicenza, but never do they look so ethereal, so dreamlike, as in the pure light of early morning. The medal, like every other made of earthly metal, has its reverse. After the delicious row from the station comes the reckoning, often a disagreeable awakening from a pleasant dream. The English or American visitor is nowadays regarded as the rightful prey of the gondolier, whom he has spoilt by misplaced generosity, and whom he sometimes irritates by unjust suspicion. The course from the station to the fashionable hotels is a long one, and the foreigner's luggage is often weighty. Sometimes the gondolier is outrageous in his demands, sometimes the forestieri are unreasonable in their withholdings. When a wrangle ensues, the latter are at a disadvantage, for even should they understand and speak Italian, they are likely to be worsted when the excited Venetian slips into his own dialect. The writer remembers how, not long ago, two young English ladies, going to a pension, not on a canal, besought the gondolier to carry their trunks from the landing place to the door of their lodging. The man refused to do so unless he were paid a preposterous extra fee. It was late, and the frightened girls were about to capitulate, when two English gentlemen came to the traghetto. Overhearing the altercation, they dismissed the gondolier with a threat of report to the vigili (police), and themselves carried their compatriots' trunks to the pension entrance. Again, if a moonlight night on the lagoons holds a charm unknown to the mainland, if the dawn seems more magical, the midday sunshine more effulgent, it cannot be denied that a wet day is drearier and more uncomfortable in Venice than in any other European city. There are days when we would thankfully exchange the steamer for a rattling bus, and the noiseless gondola for a snorting taxicab, when all traffic is dislocated by fog or wind, when even the shelter of a felze, the hearse-like hood of the gondola, is denied to us, and it is an adventure to cross the Grand Canal near its mouth, and impossible to steer across the channel of the Giudecca. In such weather, an arrival at night is no delicious dream, but a veritable nightmare. No gondolas are waiting at the station stairs, and the traveller stands dripping and impatient, while a shivering facchino shouts "Poppe" till he is hoarse. If the wind is strong and gusty, it may be necessary to employ a second rower, secondo remo, to avoid the wider canals as far as possible, and to study carefully both wind and tide. In very wild weather it is safer to leave one's heavy luggage at the station, and go on board one of the steamers, vaporetti, which ply from early dawn to midnight up and down the Grand Canal, calling at various points. Very occasionally even this means of locomotion fails us. In a thick sea fog there is nothing for it but to fall back on Shanks's mare, or, as the Italians say more picturesquely, the Cavallo di San Francesco. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Things Seen in Venice by Lonsdale and Laura Ragg. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Grand Canal. If Venice is unique as a city, surely there is nothing even in Venice more interesting and beautiful than the Grand Canal, Il Canalazzo. as the natives call it. This is the Ringstrasse, the Unter den Linden of Venice, its Piccadilly and Regent Circus, and I know not what else, in one. The beautiful sweep of its curves, combined with the historic interest and dignity of its buildings, recalls, perhaps more than anything else, the immortal High at Oxford. But the comparison is, after all, but a poor one. If, by an inconceivable misfortune, the Grand Canal should at some future date be called to suffer as some of its humbler colleagues suffered under the Austrian regime, and be drained and filled up with rubble and solid paving, and converted into a street, a Rio Terra, as the Venetians would say, it would still be far and away the most glorious street in Europe. As it is, the quaint and variegated beauty of its palaces, where the 12th, the 14th, and the 18th century jostle one another in friendly and harmonious juxtaposition, gains infinitely from the proximity of the water. Here, in rare moments of stillness, the whole architectural line is reflected, while the different degrees of disturbance caused by light breeze or passing gondola have each its sequence of fantastically broken reflection to enhance the glow of the picture. Even the wash of the penny steamer, the tram as the natives call it, by a quaint metaphor, or of the motor launch, whose toot toot does its best to assimilate the noise of Venetian traffic to that of other towns, cannot entirely destroy the effect on a bright sunny day. The general result upon the eye is that of a dark green palette, on which the colours of the architectural harmony above are fantastically mixed. When a steamer or motor launch passes, the mixture is at its weirdest, and you see more of the palette. From the steps of the railway station quay one sees the Canalazzo winding to the right hand and to the left. If we follow it to the right, we soon reach its western end, by turning sharp to the right again, past the purlieus of the goods station and under a bridge, and so into the north-western lagoon near the line of the railway viaduct, which stretches in an apparently endless series of arches towards the mainland. The left bank of the Grand Canal, as we move in this direction, is flanked by buildings quaintly picturesque, but for the most part mean and squalid, relieved by the green patch of the Papadopoli garden. Adjoining this is a humble edifice interesting to Englishmen as the British Sailors' Institute. The right bank is monopolised by the offices, sheds and warehouses pertaining to the railway terminus. If, however, we would see the glories of the Canalazzo, we must move eastward, turning to the left as we leave the station steps, under the useful but hideous iron bridge. It is rather north of east that we shall move at first, then due east, then south beneath the famous Rialto bridge, then south with a touch of west for a longish spell, till by the great Foscari Palace we sweep round to the south-east, and finally east, with the slightest deflection northwards, past the long line of hotels to the Piazzetta, the Doge's Palace, and the sunny Riva degli Schiavone. Il Canalazzo serpenteggia. The canal behaves like a twisted serpent, or a reversed letter S. This characteristic adds greatly to its beauty, for it modulates at different points the lines and the direction of light and shade, but it muddles the stranger dreadfully as to the points of the compass, and distorts most inconveniently his impression of the topography of the city. It also makes the housing problem very confusing for the ambitious Anglo-Saxon who wishes to establish himself on the sunny side of the Grand Canal. Following the canal down from the station towards the Rialto, the buildings on which the eye rests to the right are, for the first reach, picturesque rather than important. The motley line includes not a little architecture that would well repay attention, but nothing that forces itself upon our notice except the classical façade and disproportionate green dome of the 18th century church of San Simeone Piccolo, till we reach the fine Byzantine 12th century building which is now the Civic Museum, a museum, by the way, worth more attention than it usually receives from English visitors. Meanwhile, the left-hand side of the canal has been full of interest. Longena's over-ornate church of the Scalzi, barefoot friars, adjoining the station, is quickly followed by the beautifully heterogeneous group of San Geremia, its lofty 13th century campanile with a modern top, standing sentry over an 18th century church, and flanked by the handsome 17th century Labbia Palace. This group, which marks the entrance to the Cannaregio, the old outlet towards Mestre and the mainland ere the railway viaduct was built, is typical of much that we shall see. Typical is the dedication of the church. The Venetians had a fondness for Old Testament saints, due it was said to their intercourse with the East. St. Jeremiah here has for his colleagues St. Job, San Giobbe, near by, and St. Moses, San Moise, and St. Samuel in the other parts of the town. Typical is the mixture of the stately and the banal in the cluster of buildings. Typical above all is the harmonious effect produced through the blending of many tints and styles by the magic of the Venetian atmosphere. It would be easy to spend many pages in a detailed description of the different palaces which flank the Grand Canal on either hand, massive Renaissance structures of the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. Prominent among these are the great Vendramin Calergi, 1481, with its refreshing green setting of garden on either side, and its noble motto, Non nobis Domine. The Pesaro, 1679. The Corner della Regina, recalling the memory of the ill-fated Queen Caterina Cornaro, though dating in its present form from 1724, and after the Rialto Bridge, the Manin, 16th century, home of Venice's last Doge, now Banca d'Italia, the Grimani, 16th century, now Court of Appeal, the Papadopoli, also 16th century, like the Manin, attributed to Sansovino, the Rezzonico, in which the poet Browning breathed his last, the somewhat less imposing row of Mocenigo palaces, in one of which Byron lodged, and the Corner della Cagrande, now official residence of the Prefect. Or again, we might make a study of the Gothic structures of the 14th and early 15th centuries. These range from the very elaborate Ca' d'Oro and the magnificent Ducal Palace, the imposing mass of the Pisani, Foscari, and Giustiniani palaces, the fine Cavalli, and its neighbour the Barbaro, facing the Accademia, to the more modest but extremely graceful buildings with pointed or ogee windows that are always appearing as we pass up and down the Grand Canal. Or once more we might devote our attention to the precious relics of a still earlier period, like the Fondaco dei Turchi, already mentioned, and the Donna and Saibante to right and left of the Traghetto of the Madonetta, all three of which date from the 12th century. Nor will the English visitor fail to mark with interest the sunny and flower-bedecked front of Cacapello, the home of the fine collection of pictures made by the late Sir Henry Layard. The churches, too, which flank the Canalazzo, though not numerous or imposing, have their interest. Besides those already spoken of near the station, we pass one on either hand before reaching the Rialto, and each of these by its name typifies the gymnastic feats of which the Venetian dialect is capable. That of Sant Eustachio, St. Eustace on the right, has dwindled into San Stai, while the temple on the left, dedicated to Santi Ermagora e Fortunato, Hermagoras and Fortunatus, has transformed itself compactly in dialect into the single name of San Marcuola. No other churches actually adjoin the Grand Canal, till, after the last bend, in sight of the iron bridge of the Accademia, we pass San Samuele, with its charming 13th century belfry on the left, followed shortly by San Vidal, St. Vitalis, at the bridge itself. But almost directly opposite San Samuele we may obtain a peep down a side canal to the right, of one of the noblest towers in Venice, the Campanile of San Barnaba. Opposite San Vidal, at the other extremity of the iron bridge, stands what remains of the 14th century church of the Carità, worked into a most inartistic group by modern Italian taste, to form the Academy of Fine Arts. Henceforth the ecclesiastical interest passes to the right-hand side of the water, till we come to the Piazzetta with its glimpse of St. Mark's. First we see the little campo or square of San Vio (St. Vitus), with its lovely Byzantine shrine. "Surely the tiniest church in Venice," says Mr. Horatio Brown, "and perhaps the oldest, for it dates from the year 917. On one side of this campo stands the modern Anglican chapel of St. George, a transformed warehouse which has no external features to attract attention to itself, but is well worth a visit for the restrained and modest dignity of its interior. By a happy combination of good fortune and good taste, a result has been obtained which suggests at once an English college chapel and the chapel of an old Venetian scuola or guild. Further down, still on the right-hand side, is the stately brown Gothic church of San Gregorio, behind the quaint quadrangle of the Abbazia, and adjacent to Longhena's 17th century temple of Our Lady of Health, Santa Maria della Salute, one of Venice's two votive plague churches. This remarkable group, which harmonizes so wonderfully with its surroundings, the Patriarchal Seminary and the Marine Custom House on the Punta della Salute, gives the Grand Canal its finishing touch. It forms such a wholly admirable feature of the landscape as one looks westward from the basin of St. Mark, the broad sheet of water into which the Canalazzo debouches, or eastward from the direction of the iron bridge, that it is almost impossible to realize that Venice lived and was admired for so many centuries without it. The total effect of this mixture of styles and scales of architecture, ecclesiastical and domestic, is indescribably interesting and delightful. The variation of colour gives an added charm, and the graceful curves of the canal itself, with the fine outline of the Rialto bridge at its central point, completes the picture. On a bright spring day, when private gondolas abound with their graceful awnings and gaily dressed gondoliers, and every note of colour is enforced by its reflection in the glittering green waters, the Grand Canal is indeed a good thing to look upon. But it is interesting at all times of day, from early morning till late at night, and in all weathers, except when a sea fog blots out the view of it. Pietro Aretino, the rascally journalist of the 16th century, has left us a record of his impressions of the Grand Canal as seen from a palace window near the Rialto bridge, and his picture would almost pass muster to-day but for the disturbing presence of the tram steamers and the manifold results of their fussy, bustling movements. This, he says, is the patriarch of all other canals, even as Venice is the chief of all other cities. I enjoy, he goes on, the fairest and most agreeable view in the whole world. When I go to my window I see hundreds of people, and as many gondolas at market time. Facing me are the meat and fish markets, the Campo del Mancino, the bridge and fondaco of the Germans. Over against these the Rialto, trodden by the feet of busy wayfarers. Weighing the counter-attractions of an invitation to enjoy the sport and refreshment offered by the mainland in autumn, he continues: "The boats I see from my window are laden with grapes, the ships with game. There are gardens in the streets themselves. Why should I want to look upon streams and meadows?" Here one would be inclined to pick a quarrel with the Arentine. He has disclosed the weakest point of Venice from the aesthetic point of view, its want of response to the call of spring and autumn, but of that more anon. Pietro proceeds to describe the delight of watching in the very early hours of the morning a great barca laden with flowers and fruit, distributing its burden to lesser boats grouped round it, and the sights with which later hours regale him of gondolas filled with fair dames in silks and jewels, the shouting gondoliers gay in scarlet hose. Pietro Aretino was certainly well placed. There can be no dispute that one of the points of chiefest interest in this patriarch of Venetian waterways is the Rialto, with its constant movement and cheerful bustle, and with the effective colour scheme furnished by the fruit and vegetable market, where the oranges, as Aretino says, spread their gold at the feet of the Camerlengi Palace. Other points have their special days or seasons of interest. Once a year, the reach where the races are rowed in the summer regatta, when the Canal is, for the nonce, as solid looking as the Thames at Henley, and, if possible, more motley in its colouring. The Bacino di San Marco, on all occasions which can be made excuse for a festa. The station steps at one end and those of the Palazzo Reale at the other, when a crowned head shows itself in Venice. On warm nights during the season, the basin of St. Mark and the mouth of the canal in front of the hotels is gay with light and singing. The barques of the singers, conspicuous by their display of Chinese lanterns, are surrounded by groups of dusky gondolas with one twinkling light apiece, and on really great occasions the scene is enlivened by the burning of red and green Bengal lights at the Punta della Salute and other points of vantage. Bands play on the Piazzetta or the Riva, and a large fairy-like structure called galleggiante, decked out with scores of coloured lamps, forms a centre for the whole group upon the water. Fireworks, whose every scintillation is doubled by reflection, give the final touch of brilliancy to the pageant. One day in the year the interest of the Grand Canal is concentrated on a point far away from San Marco. We must return to a spot which we marked as interesting in our hasty survey, the point where the ancient Fondaco dei Turchi and the Non Nobis Palace face one another from opposite sides of the water. To listen to an excellent Wagner concert, seated as in an opera box under the felze, and on the comfortable cushions of a gondola, gently rocked by the movement of the tide, is a singularly pleasant way of spending a February afternoon, and one which may be enjoyed annually by the inhabitants of Venice. On February 13th, the anniversary of Richard Wagner's death, the well-trained and admirably conducted municipal band gives a selection of the great composer's works, not in the Piazza, the usual place of its performances, but beneath the portico of the Museo Civico, one of the most glorious palaces on the Grand Canal. This palace dates, as we have seen, from the 9th century, and is a magnificent example of the Italian Byzantine style. In 1621 it was purchased by the Venetian Republic from the House of Este, and converted into a warehouse and place of business for Turkish merchants, who paid rent for it. Henceforth it was known as the Fondaco dei Turchi. In the middle of the 19th century it was thoroughly restored and arranged for its present use as a municipal museum. The Vendramin Palace opposite was erected for the great Venetian family of Loredan by one of the Lombardi. Few places in the city have changed hands by sale so frequently. The last sellers were the Vendramini, whose name still clings to it, and the last purchaser, the Duchess de Berry, mother of Henry V, Comte de Chambord, from whom it came by inheritance to the present owners. Built of grey Istrian stone, with pillars of marble, medallions of porphyry, spacious mullioned windows, and a pleasant garden overlooking the canal, it unites the strength of a fortress, the dignity of a Renaissance dwelling-house, and the comfort and light demanded by modern luxury. It was in the mezzanino of this palace, the low story between the ground floor and the piano nobile, that Richard Wagner died some 28 years ago, and the strains of his music which float across the canal and rise to the apartment which he used to love are the serenade of the living to a great shade. The noble building of which we have just been speaking may well form the text of a short digression upon the normal construction of a Venetian palace. For the splendid homes of the merchant princes of the Republic, in which, to the lasting benefit of posterity, they did not shrink from sinking the bulk of their capital, are nearly all of them constructed on a single model — the model, with one modification, of the native country house. In one essential point the Venetian building differs from that of the mainland — in the nature, that is, of its foundations. Venice stands upon myriads of wooden piles driven deeply and firmly into the mud of the banks on which its original inhabitants took refuge from the unspeakable horrors of barbarian invasion. On these piles, driven home to the accompaniment of weird traditional songs, as may still be heard and witnessed occasionally by the lucky visitor, immensely heavy blocks of stone are laid, and upon them is built up the extremely solid and massive structure of the Venetian palace. The building is in 4, 5, or 6 stories, each of which is divided by thick party walls into 3 long sections running from front to back. The central section in each story has no lateral partitions, but forms a sort of lighting and ventilating shaft, having large windows at either end. The 2 side sections are divided into a number of smaller parts — chambers, offices, etc., to which access is gained by doors opening into the central section, the sala or hall, or else, in the case of offices or back premises, directly from the staircase. Each floor is very solidly constructed of concrete (terrazza) laid on strong wooden beams placed the short way across from wall to wall, one close upon another. In some of the palaces these ceiling beams, elaborately painted and gilded, form a conspicuous adornment. The lowest floor, next the water, is, generally speaking, quite uninhabitable by reason of the damp, and is used only for the storage of the gondola and its appurtenances. It serves, however, of necessity as the entrance to the house, approached at the front end by gondola and from the back on foot, the back door opening upon a small courtyard, or more often directly upon one of those narrow and crooked alleys (cagli the Venetians call them) which the pedestrian in Venice is forced to traverse. The entrance on the land side, says Pietro Aretino, is in this habitation dark and tortuous, and the staircase is bad. As to the approach on foot, his words would be true of almost any Venetian palace, even the grandest. The Vendramin, the Rezzonico is another, being one of the very few exceptions in which the land entrance attains even a tolerable standard of decency and seemliness. Yet the fact remains, little suspected by the average visitor, that practically every house in Venice can be approached on foot. The story next above the ground floor in a Venetian palace is called, as we have said, the mezzanino or mezzanin. It is not so lofty as those above it, and where a single family still occupies the entire palace, it forms a convenient refuge for the winter months. Winters are cold in Venice, though for the most part sunny, being more easily warmed than the spacious piano nobile. In the mezzanin the merchant prince transacted such business as could be done at home, and an office in Venice is to this day styled a mezza. The piano nobile, or reception floor, is an apartment of great dignity and beauty in a typical palazzo. The long and finely proportioned sala has frequently a picturesque balcony on the waterfront, to which access is gained through an arcade formed by a group of pointed ogee or round-headed windows. The windows or openings at either end of the sala were in former days unglazed, leaving the hall open to all weathers — a veritable ventilating shaft, as we have said, for the whole house. But in these days of luxury and softness the windows are all glazed, and the hall, where the ancient Venetian used to sit, if he sat there at all, in furs and hat, has degenerated into a modern drawing-room. It is only fair to add that it makes one of the finest and most dignified drawing-rooms conceivable, and the views from its front windows, especially if the palace be on the Grand Canal, are indescribably fascinating. Not seldom there are 2 noble floors, in one of which the eldest married child would, in old days, have been ensconced. To day such an apartment is considered a valuable financial asset, and is in most cases let to a separate family, as is often done also with the mezzanine, and not seldom with the uppermost story of all. This ultimo piano, devoted in former days to the servants and retainers of the house, is usually of about the same proportions as the mezzanine, but has the advantage of much more sunlight and a purer and drier air. It is greatly to be recommended to those who would find no difficulty in ascending 2 or 3 times a day 3 or 4 score of hard and sometimes steep stone stairs. One notable advantage the Venetian palace derives from the peculiarity of its foundations. Massive and heavy as is its structure, it is one of the safest habitations in the world in time of earthquake. The foundation is elastic, and consequently the whole building can oscillate securely in one piece. Before we leave the Canalazzo, there is one more point that demands our attention — the traghetto. There are in all 11 of these traghetti, or public ferries, on the Grand Canal, and they form, historically as well as aesthetically, one of the most picturesque features of that noble waterway. The group of boats lying at the foot of a quaint collection of wooden water steps, amid a crowd of crooked wooden posts, only 1 degree less crooked than their own reflections in the green water. In the background, a more or less animated cluster of stalwart figures, centred round a wooden shelter, enlivened sometimes by a tint of growing green, vine or other creeper, and furnished with a little shrine of the patron saint of the traghetto, adds an extra touch of beauty even to the Canalazzo. Every traghetto, moreover, has its own individuality. True, at every ferry you pay the same fare, a penny (palanca) by night, and half that sum (mezza palanca or cinque schei) by day, laying your obol on the gunwale of the boat like one of Charon's ghostly passengers. At every ferry you may have similar experiences, and overhear similar conversations, but the subtle difference remains, and it carries us back by suggestion to the days, not so very long ago, when each traghetto was a close corporation with its own guild chapel and religious ceremonies, with its jealously guarded rites and customs, a sort of benefit club with a monopoly of the gains accruing from the proceeds of the ferrying within a certain area. In course of time, even during the days of the Republic, the gondoliers of the traghetti forfeited one by one their most cherished privileges, forfeited them by their own short-sighted and insensate behaviour, till now the last relic of real independence has left them. They are simply servants of the municipality, to which they are responsible for the efficiency and continuity of the ferry service by day and by night. But their officers, an annually elected Gastaldo at the head and 4 Bancali to support him, still bear the same names which Mr. Horatio Brown has found in the old charters of the traghetto guilds or scuole, dating in some cases from the 14th century. The traghetto, even in these degenerate days, when one of its proud members may be handed over for insolence or neglect of duty to the police by any irate foreigner or fellow citizen, has still its elaborate rules of rotation and precedence, and, no doubt, its jealously guarded customs and traditions. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Things Seen in Venice by Lonsdale and Laura Ragg. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Heart of Venice. I never, during 3 years, passed through it in my daily walks without feeling, as freshly as at first, the greatness of its beauty. Thus wrote Howells of the Piazza of San Marco, and his words are echoed by every foreigner who elects for any lengthy period to make a home in Venice. Thronged for a public festa, brilliant with flags and hangings, and echoing to the strains of music, silent and deserted on frosty starlit nights, or in the early dawn of soft warm mornings, with its shops brightly illuminated on winter afternoons, or shrouded with awnings from a burning summer sun. At all hours and in every season the Piazza is a thing of beauty, rejoicing the hearts of those who visit it, and drawing them with magnetic attraction to itself. Other open spaces in Venice, even the big Campo Santa Margherita and Campo San Polo, are fields. This is the square par excellence. Once, we are told, it was so full of merchants and strangers that it might have been called the Forum Orbis non Urbis. In one sense it is so still, only the cosmopolitan crowd of to-day is bent on pleasure rather than on business. Certainly all classes mingle here in a happy proximity unknown in Paris, London, or New York. On fine summer evenings, when the band plays, and chairs and tables are spread far out on the pavement in front of the cafes, groups of men and women of all sorts and conditions sit side by side enjoying the inexpensive luxuries of music, fresh air, chatter and flirtations, with long drawn-out gustations of coffee and sciroppi. The only exception to the liberty, equality and fraternity of the Piazza is the understanding among Venetian residents that in the evening ladies should be taken to Florian's, the famous café that has not closed its doors day and night for 300 years, rather than to the less expensive cafés on the north side of the Piazza. And here, perhaps, I may inconsequently insert a piece of useful information. On sultry evenings, 2 drinks rarely ordered by English people are much to be recommended: tamarind syrup, tamarindo, with ice and aerated water, aqua gazzosa, and iced black coffee sweetened to taste with sugar dissolved into a syrup. The woman of the people does not feel a festa complete unless she has been in Piazza to hear the band. It is un jour perdu for a Venetian elegante if she has been unable on a winter morning to take a turn in Piazza before luncheon. The man whose business is not too far distant adjourns to the Piazza after his midday meal to take a cup of coffee in the sunshine. Leisured patricians linger in Piazza before entering or leaving the fashionable club. The well-to-do babes of Venice clamour to be taken to Piazza to see the pigeons, and their balie, wet nurses, handsome women from the Friuli, are only too pleased to fall in with their charges' wishes. Visitors, chiefly English and American, frequent Lavena's tea-rooms at 5 o'clock, and at all hours gaze into the windows where lace, jewellery, beads and glass are displayed, and fall victims to exasperating touts, who pounce on the unwary with invitations to visit glass or lace factories. Once, on one never-to-be-forgotten occasion, I beheld the Piazza as thickly thronged at 2 o'clock at night as on any festal afternoon or evening. Shortly after the terrible earthquake in Sicily, Venice experienced a sharp though brief shock. Everyone, believing that this was but the beginning of further disaster, rushed into the largest available open space, regardless of the fact that it was all too small for safety. Florian's did a good trade that night, for though the weather was serene and still, there was a nip in the air, and when the first terror had subsided, hot drinks were sought with avidity. The wonders of the Piazza are epitomised in a Venetian quatrain. In Piazza San Marco che c'è 3 standardi, che c'è 4 cavalli, che parcheis vola, che c'è un relogio, che pare un torre, che c'è domori, che batte le ore. In St. Mark's Place there are 3 standards. There are 4 horses that seem to fly. There is a clock which seems a tower. There are 2 Moors who beat the hours. Banners float from the standards on Sundays and holidays, and at once give the Piazza a festal appearance. The bronze bases, designed by Alessandro Leopardi, 1505, are decorated and decorative to a high degree. The 4 horses ramp on the gallery over the central door of St. Mark's. These 4 steeds divine that strike the ground resounding with their feet, and from their nostrils snort ethereal flame, have moved a great deal in the course of their long lives. They were taken from the triumphal arch of Titus to adorn the Greek New Rome, taken from Constantinople by the Venetians, from Venice by the great robber Napoleon, from Paris to Venice again by the Emperor Francis Joseph. The Torre dell'Orologio is on our left as we stand by the standards looking towards the 4 bronze horses. It ends the line of buildings on the north side of the Piazza, and looks towards the basin of St. Mark. It is in 4 stories. First, there is a great arch, sustained by marble pillars. Secondly, there is the big blue and gold dial. Above this is the gilded statue of the Madonna, standing on a projecting semicircular base, with a little door on either side. Higher still, and this section is really a tower detached from and above the main building, is a field of starred azure, on which is seen in half relief a lion and the figure of a kneeling Doge. When the clock strikes 12 on Ascension Day, figures of the Magi, nearly life-size, emerge from one of the little doors of the 3rd story, pass before the Madonna, doing reverence, and disappear through the other door. If John Evelyn is to be believed, this little procession in his day took place daily at 12 o'clock and 6, the hours of the Ave Maria, when all the town are on their knees. The clock tower is surmounted by the 2 Moors, huge bronze figures with a bell between them, on which they strike alternately with hammers. An honest merchant told me, says Evelyn, that one day walking in the Piazza, he saw the fellow who kept the clock struck with their hammer so forcibly as he was stooping his head near the bell, that, being stunned, he reeled over the battlements and broke his neck. The pigeons which figure so largely in Venetian photographs might almost be reckoned as a 5th wonder of the Piazza. They are probably the descendants of pigeons which used to be let loose with shackled legs from the balcony over the west door of St. Mark's, as part of a Palm Sunday largesse to the populace. Some of these birds escaped and took sanctuary among the spires and domes of the Basilica, an act which appealed to the sentiment and superstition of the Venetians, who henceforth not only spared but fed the doves of St. Mark. They now subsist on private charity, and fare well on it, while the men who sell pennyworths of corn for their consumption also benefit by the liberality of children and strangers to these tame, glossy, prosperous denizens of St. Mark's Place. A 6th wonder of the Piazza is undoubtedly the new campanile, erected with the greatest archaeological care and the highest engineering skill to replace the old one, which in July 1902 quietly sat down, as though worn out by its long watching. Hardly less wonderful will be the restoration of the Loggia, built by Sansovino in 1540 as a meeting place for the Venetian nobles. It was, of course, overwhelmed by the fall of the giant who had sheltered it, but its fragments were collected and gradually pieced together in one of the rooms of the ducal palace, so that, though the original plans have not yet been found, the Loggia of Sansovino, little yet of singular and incomparable beauty as Coriat found it, will once again adorn the Piazza. Much has been urged and may be urged for and against these restorations. No one can deny that the distant view of Venice from the water lost much by the absence of the tall streak of the campanile. The view from its summit, moreover, is a great gain to the tourist, enabling him to understand at a glance the plan and situation of the city, though with a curious geographical delusion. Seen from a height, the roofs hide the intersecting canals, and Venice appears without her waterways. The sentimental argument has a double edge and cuts both ways. As to the aesthetic arguments, de gustibus non disputandum. Speaking as a dispassionate foreigner who has seen Venice with and without its campanile, yet has not the sentiment of a Venetian for a dear familiar object, I avow that the Piazza seems to me more dignified and harmonious sans bell tower, and that St. Mark's, already dwarfed apparently by the height of the buildings to its right and left, and actually by repeated raisings of the pavement level, appears to crouch yet lower when overshadowed by its gigantic sentinel. It is interesting to compare the present aspect of the Piazza with its appearance in the 15th century, as shown in Gentile Bellini's famous picture of a procession. On the left we see the Procuratie Vecchie looking much as they do in a modern photograph, but on the right a building of more ancient character adjoins the campanile. This was the hospital of Doge Pietro Orseolo. In 1582 the hospital was removed to Campo San Gallo, and the dwellings beyond it were demolished. The present line of buildings was then erected further back, and became the official residence of the procurators of the Republic. Though over 300 years old, and long since converted into a royal palace, this building is still known as the Procuratie Nuove. Early in the 19th century an extension of the palace in the same style was carried across the west end of the Piazza, occupying the site of the old church of San Geminiano, demolished by Napoleon. It is doubtful whether the widening of the Piazza and isolation of the Campanile were improvements from an aesthetic point of view. As the termination of a line of buildings, the great tower, one would think, must have risen dominating but not obtrusive. St. Mark's, at the end of a narrower oblong, must have been seen from the west in better perspective, while the Piazza must have shown more obviously as the outer court of the wonderful temple. This little book does not pretend to be a guide to St. Mark's. Tourists will have no difficulty in supplying themselves with detailed information about the Basilica and the Ducal Palace, while those who would see them through an artist's eyes, and hear them described in the language of a prose poet, have only to turn the pages of the Stones of Venice and of St. Mark's Rest. Visitors who have several days to spend in Venice will do well to enter St. Mark's frequently, steeping themselves in its colour and studying its details bit by bit. Those whose time is limited, or who, accustomed only to the grey majesty of our northern cathedrals, feel bewildered, possibly disappointed, before a structure corresponding to nothing in their previous experience, may perhaps be helped to obtain certain broad impressions which will fix themselves lastingly on the memory. First of all, then, let us stand, as early in the morning as may be, in the shadow of the portico in the middle of the west side of the Piazza. From this Bocca di Piazza, mouth of the square, we see a multitude of pillars and white domes, clustered into a long low pyramid of coloured light, a treasure heap it seems, partly of gold and partly of opal and mother of pearl, hollowed beneath into 5 great vaulted porches, sealed with fair mosaics (Ruskin). 5 doors of bronze are sunk in these 5 porches, the recesses of which are pillared with various precious marbles. Above them is a second tier of 5 arches, parted from the first by a loggia, which runs across the façade and is protected by 364 columns. The upper arches are shallow. The central one behind the bronze horses is larger than the other 4, and is a window protected by stone lattice work. The crests of the arches break into a marble foam and toss themselves far into the blue sky in flashes and wreaths of sculptured spray. After studying this lovely façade from a point somewhere about the line of the standards, we may enter the Basilica, stepping down where the old Venetians ascended, for, to avoid inundation, the pavement has been raised repeatedly. We find ourselves in the vestibule, or atrio, and here the exquisite carving of the capitals should be noted, as also the mosaics of the vaulting, which tell the story of the creation, fall, deluge, and lives of the patriarchs. A door on the right leads to the beautiful baptistry elaborately described by Ruskin. Now let us push aside the curtain and descend into the twilight of the church. At first we see nothing distinctly, but we are very conscious of colour palpitating in the atmosphere, and streaming out from walls and pavement. By degrees we realise that this pavement, undulating gently like the canals, is formed of precious marbles, that the walls glow with priceless incrustations, that the brightness overhead is due to shafts of light striking through narrow apertures in the domes upon the crowded imagery of great tracts of mosaic. It is the church of a city which, till the discovery of the Cape route, was the great repository and mart of Oriental produce, and which derived almost equal advantages from war or alliance with the Turk. This wealth of mosaic reflects the history of Venice, reflects the flair of her merchants, connoisseurs of precious stones and gems, reflects the temper of a people who had absorbed much of the lavishness and luxury of Eastern civilization. But the Orientalism caught by the builders of St. Mark's was chastened by Greek feeling, while it was applied in the spirit of Gothic architecture. The result is a place of worship in the most true and emphatic sense of the phrase, a temple exceeding magnifical, rich beyond the dreams of avarice, ingenious with the skill of cunning workmen, where yet one never thinks of the costliness, scarcely ever of the skill displayed, but always of the effect of glory they create. Some prefer the pure design. Give me my glut of colour, gorge of gold, comes to be the prevailing sentiment of those inhabitants of Venice who turn into St. Mark's at all hours and seasons, and luxuriate in the colour which no words and scarcely any brush can reproduce. Moving forward up the nave, we notice the architrave of the screen, with its great bronze crucifix and the 14th century figures of Christ, his mother, and his apostles, the work of two brothers called after the hard stone which they carved, della Macegne. Macigno is a hard limestone. On either side of the screen are two pulpits. The larger on the north side is octangular, sustained by 13 columns, and in 2 tiers. From the lower tier the epistle is read, from the upper the gospel. On the south side is the pulpit called Bigonzo, from which the Doge used to be presented to the people, and where on Maundy Thursday and Ascension Day the relics are exhibited. The high altar must be noticed, with its canopy of verde antico, supported by 4 marble columns with interesting reliefs of the 11th century. The Palla d'Oro, which is in its glory on high festivals, can be uncovered and viewed at other times on payment of 50 centimes. It is a magnificent specimen of the goldsmith's work of Constantinople. Made originally in 1105, it was restored with additions in the 2 succeeding centuries. But alas, most of its jewels were carried off by the French in 1797, and inferior stones replaced them. Behind the high altar to the left, a little bronze door leads to the sacristy. It should be noticed, for its maker, Sansovino, adorned it with portraits of his contemporaries. A few minutes at least should then be spent in the gallery, reached by a little staircase on the left of the principal entrance door. From this point of vantage the mosaics of the domes are seen more easily than from below, and very beautiful views of the choir may be obtained. The Piazza has 2 prolongations. It curls round the Basilica on the north. It thrusts a straight arm out to the Bacino, basin or harbour, on the south. The first extension is called Piazzetta dei Leoncini, from 2 red marble lions erected there in the 18th century. It contains the ever-useful cook's office, and leads to the Palace of the Patriarch, the title, borrowed from the East, of the Archbishop of Venice. The south extension is the Piazzetta, tout court, where stand, like sentinels, 2 slender granite columns. They were brought from Greece, with a third one which fell into the water during disembarkation and could not be raised. The remaining 2 lay long on the ground, till a Lombard, one Niccolo Baratiero, succeeded in erecting them. When asked to name his reward, he begged that gambling, prohibited by the Venetian Republic, should be permitted between the columns. The authorities stultified their permission by making the spot the place of public execution, and therefore of ill luck. On the summit of one column is the symbol of the winged lion, on the other is St. Theodore, St. Mark's predecessor in the office of protector of the city. He was the first patron saint of Venice, till in A.D. 823 2 valiant Venetians stole the body of the evangelist from Alexandria. At one time the Piazzetta extended but a few paces beyond the columns, and in front of them was the boat where those sent to the galleys practised rowing. Then the Molo or esplanade was formed in front of the Doge's palace, and what is now the Royal Garden. Up till 1808, when the gardens were made, this space was occupied by granaries. It is a sunny spot, beloved by Venetian loiterers. Turning our backs to the water and looking again towards the Piazza, we see on our left the Libreria Vecchia, the old library, built by Sansovino on a site formerly occupied by inns. The beginning of the work was unfortunate, for in frosty weather, in 1545, an important part of the building suddenly collapsed, and the architect was thrown into prison. Released through the intercession of his friends, especially of the much feared Aretino, he continued the work till his death in 1570, leaving it to be completed by his disciple Scamozzi. It is exceedingly stately and beautiful, so beautiful that Palladio pronounced it the most perfect building designed since the days of ancient Rome. Between it and the royal garden, towards the south, is the Zecca, from which the name of the coin zecchino sequin is derived, or mint, now the home of St. Mark's Library, which between 1812 and 1905 had been lodged over the way in the Ducal Palace. Like the Libreria Vecchia, it was designed by Sansovino, who, as a precaution against fire, built it of iron and marble, using no wood in its construction. It is a delightful place to read in, whether we sit in the great hall used as a general reading room, or penetrate into the quiet sala reserved for readers of manuscripts. The early Flemish breviary, known as Breviario Grimani, and the fine copy of the Divina Commedia of the late 14th century, should be inspected by all book lovers. On the other side of the Piazzetta is the building which was once the palace, prison, senate house, and law courts of the Republic, and is now its monument. Most of us are familiar with the Ducal Palace long before we set foot in Venice. With its 3 tiers increasing in solidity upwards, it reverses the customs of architecture, and its remarkable shape, once seen in photograph or print, is deeply impressed on the memory. Yet only those who have seen it from the Piazza and from the lagoon, in cloud and sunshine, in the early morning and on warm, fair afternoons, can know the loveliness of the colour produced by the chequerwork of red and white marble with which the brick core is overlaid. The 36 columns of the open colonnade running round the west and south sides of the building have no bases, and appear rather stumpy, a defect largely due to repeated raisings of the Piazza level. Their capitals are extremely beautiful, and those at the angles should be studied carefully, if possible with Ruskin's enthusiastic elucidations. The east side, abutting on Rio Canal, can only be viewed from a gondola, and, says Ruskin, there are few things in Italy more impressive than the vision of it overhead as the gondola glides from beneath the Bridge of Sighs. The bridge itself, leading from the criminal courts to the criminal prisons on the further side of the canal, is a commonplace construction of the 16th century, quite unworthy of its fallacious sentimental reputation. Before going over the Ducal Palace, a long and fatiguing bit of sightseeing, to which the entire morning must be given up, some curiosities close to its principal gateway should be noticed. These are 2 short pillars with Greek inscriptions brought by the Venetians from Acre, a block of porphyry known as the Pietra del Bando, Stone of the Decree, from which the decrees of the Republic were announced, and 2 pairs of male figures in red porphyry let into the corner of St. Mark's nearest the palace. Probably these quaint couples represent 4 emperors who shared the Byzantine throne in the 11th century, but the English traveller, Coryat, gives a different account of them. 4 brothers, he says, came from Albania to Venice. 2 went ashore, 2 remained on the richly laden ship. Each pair plotted to rid itself of the other, and at a banquet all 4 died by poison mutually administered. Whereupon the Venetian state seized on their treasures, and as a memorial of the event and its sequel, portrayed the wicked brothers in this curious fashion. I confess I never read this history, says good old Coryat, with touching faith in the veracity of printed matter. But many gentlemen of very good account in Venice, both Englishmen and others, reported it to me for an absolute truth. The gateway of the palace, in this corner near the church, is extraordinarily beautiful and ornate. It is called the Porta della Carta, the Paper Gate, because the decrees of the Republic were placarded here. It was also called Porta Dorata, from the gold with which it was emblazoned. The figure of the kneeling Doge above the arch is modern, the original having been destroyed by the French in 1797. Through this gate the visitor will enter the cortile, where he will look at Riccio's great statues of Adam and Eve, and the fine Renaissance work of the two bronze cisterns. He will ascend the giant's staircase, so named from Sansovino's statues of Mars and Neptune, between which later Doges were crowned in the sight of an acclaiming populace in the court below. He will pass up the Scala d'Oro, golden staircase, once trodden only by patricians, whose names were written in the Golden Book. He will find himself in the great rooms where the rulers of the Republic met to decide the destinies of the little state which played so great a part in European history. He will read its annals in the series of 16th century paintings which adorn the palace walls, and he will look at the only specimen of earlier work remaining there, the recently discovered fresco of Guariento of Padua, which has been found beneath the gigantic Paradise of Tintoretto, and has been treated with marvellous skill and judgment. Then, with eye and brain wearied with detailed information, imaginative efforts, and wealth of visual impression, the traveller will do well to emerge on to the loggia on the south side of the great hall overhanging the Molo, and to linger there a while. The salt breeze from the Adriatic will bring him refreshment, and his tired eye will rest on the lovely grouping of the buildings on the island of San Giorgio Maggiore, on the dancing waters of the basin, on the green line of the Lido, and on the far-off reaches of the peaceful lagoon. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Things Seen in Venice by Lonsdale and Laura Ragg. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Venice on foot. The casual visitor to Venice, more especially if he be, as many are, inclined to spend his fortnight there as luxuriously as possible, often leaves the city without any suspicion that the whole of it, practically, can be traversed on foot. He finds gondolas waiting all day long within call of the concierge of his hotel, or perhaps, with self-congratulatory foresight, he has engaged a particular gondolier by the week. For the longer trips, to Torcello, Murano, or Chioggia, he arranges that his gondolier shall deposit him at the place where the steamboat starts. Possibly, in rare moments when the instinct of economy gets the better of him, he may occasionally take the tram steamer to the Lido or up to the Grand Canal. Only in the Piazza and its purlieus does he condescend to set foot to ground, except where his gondola lands him, by grace of the Rampino, the chartered libertine of an old man with a boat-hook, who claims to earn a halfpenny more or less at every disembarkation. Having feed this worthy and well-meaning veteran, usually an ex-gondolier past work, the tourist visits the church or other object which he has set out to see, and returns post-haste to the comfortable cushions which it had cost him some effort to leave. But whoso would explore at all fully the beauties which Venice offers at every turn, must say good-bye to the gondola cushions for hours together, and take to his feet, and to the somewhat uneven pavement on which the Venetian habitually walks. He will find that the network of side canals which presents so many quaint corners and picturesque vistas to the delighted eye as one glides slowly along in gondola, is supplemented by a still more elaborate network of narrow and tortuous lanes. These calli, as they are called, provide an access for foot passengers to every Venetian dwelling and public building, and furnish, incidentally, numberless little gems of beauty and interest, that can only be seen by the enterprising pedestrian. So true is this, that the late Colonel Hugh Douglas took the trouble to compile an elaborate and systematic Guide to Venice on Foot, and a very useful little book it is. Without a careful study of the map, the foreigner will find it no easy task to find his way along the calli. These alleys have many angles in their course, and few indeed of such angles are right angles. You may know quite well in what direction you started, but I defy anyone without a pocket compass to be sure of the direction in which his face is set after 10 minutes' progress along the Venetian thoroughfares. An ordinary bump of topography is absolutely useless in this mad city, where all the buildings seem to have been thrown down quite capriciously and haphazard, like toy bricks on the nursery floor of some Titan's child. Even the natives, if you should ask them the way to some object 5 minutes' walk distant, will probably answer politely, "I cannot explain it to the signor, but I will accompany him." One afternoon I met at 2 minutes' distance from San Stefano a born Venetian who anxiously inquired of me the way to that church. When I showed him how near we were to the object of his quest, he explained his ignorance by saying, "Io sono di Castello, signor." He belonged to the eastern division of the city, the sestiere of Castello, so he could not be expected to possess any acquaintance with the topography of another quarter. The municipality does its best to keep us informed. There is no lack of clearly painted instructions and directions at every important corner in each of the campielli or campi, the name given to all the squares or open spaces other than the piazza. 2 or 3, or sometimes even 4, lines of inscription explain to the instructed traveller his whereabouts. But the stranger certainly needs a little preliminary instruction, otherwise the thoughtful care of a grandmotherly municipio will only cause him increased embarrassment. What would the uninstructed make, for instance, of an inscription such as this: Sestieri di Canareggio, Parrochia Santi Ermagora e Fortunato, San Marcuola, Fondamenta e Rio della Malvasia? At the risk, therefore, of tediousness, it will be wise, before committing ourselves to the sinuosities of the Venetian calle, to spend a moment or two on technical terms. The city of Venice is divided, and has been divided since the 12th century, into 6 sections called sestieri. 3 of these are on the north side of the Grand Canal: Canareggio, which includes the railway station, on the west; San Marco in the middle; and Castello, including the arsenal and the public gardens, on the east. On the other side of the Canalazzo are the sestieri of Sancta Croce, facing the railway station and verging to the west; San Paulo, occupying the central position; and Dorsoduro, a large sestiere which embraces not only the region lying to the south of the San Marco end of the Grand Canal, but also, further south again, the separate island of the Giudecca. The houses in each of these sestieri are numbered straight on, not according to the number of houses in a given street or calle. Thus, one of a group or row of half a dozen dwellings may be the proud possessor of a numerical title which runs into 4 figures. There is an item in the largest sestiere, that of Castello, which attains to the formidable total of number 6848. Beneath the name of the sestiere comes ordinarily that of the parish. There are in all 30 parishes in Venice, including that of San Eufemia on the Giudecca, and many of them bear the names of little known or quaintly disguised saints. We have already spoken of the way in which 2 quadrisyllabic names were transformed into the more manageable San Marcuola. Another instance of the same process of transformation is to be found on one of the most picturesque of the side canals in the sestiere of Dorsoduro, within 2 minutes' walk of the Accademia or Art Gallery. Here the 2 saints, Gervasius and Protasius, have consented to be known compactly as San Trovaso. Most of the Venetian churches are approached from an open space, a little square which is invariably named after the church's patron saint. Such a square is not dignified with the name of Piazza so and so, as it would be in any other Italian city. It is called Campo, or if it be very small, Campiello. Campo, i.e. meadow, is a word that suggests at once Venice's chief defect. The truth is that in former days grass did really grow in these open spaces, where now all is a wilderness of paving stones. These campi and campielli, especially those more remote from the more frequented canals, are well worth inspection. There one may often see Venetian life in its naive state, watch the popolino, the proletariat as we should say, enjoying itself in its own chosen ways, and hear the soft dialect to perfection. A typical campo of the plebeian sort is the spacious but not very dignified Campo Santa Margherita in the parish of Santa Maria del Carmine. A few of the campi, like that of San Paulo, are on certain days, by permission of the authorities, converted into drying grounds for the laundresses. All of them, without exception, become playgrounds for the children of the neighbourhood out of school hours. Scenes of such incessant and strident, though good-tempered uproar, that those whose lodging abuts upon a campo or campiello are often tempted to wish that the Italian child was kept at school for more hours in the day. A special feature of interest in most of the campi is the well-head, now supplied with splendid water by aqueduct from the mountain, a point of meeting and an excuse for gossip for many a lively and picturesque group of women. Some of the finest well-heads, from an artistic point of view, are to be found in enclosed courtyards, be it the grand quadrangle of the ducal palace, or some secluded and forgotten corte in the less known parts of the city. These little corti have no outlet, as a rule, except the entrance, and if a stranger, moved by curiosity, or enticed by a glimpse of some unusually picturesque object, be seen to enter one, the chances are that he will be annoyed by the shouts of well-meaning but officious boys, "Non si passa! Non si passa!" as much as to say, "No thoroughfare." The same fate may overtake him, and with more reason, if he turn down a calle, and there are many of them, which is a cul-de-sac. He who is bold enough and wise enough to explore Venice on foot must be prepared for sundry false leads and momentary embarrassments. When he is just congratulating himself on having discovered a genuine short cut, 10 to 1 he will find himself suddenly pulled up by green water. His cleverness has only led him to an impassable side canal, and he must humbly retrace his steps. Not every such adventure is a waste of time, however. Very likely the blind alley may have introduced him to some graceful little scrap of sculpture let into a most unlikely wall, or to some pathetically cared-for miniature shrine of the Madonna, not mentioned in any guide-book, nor known to the average well-informed student of Venice. Besides calle, campo, campielle, and corte, there are various other mystic signs inscribed upon the walls. Callesella is the diminutive of calle, and is applied to a passage of even narrower proportions than the normal ones, in which two people can scarcely pass one another without touching. Sottoportico is a name applied to a covered way, often leading into a corte. Ponte, of course, means bridge. There are between 300 and 400 of them in Venice, connecting the footways on this side and that of the numberless small canals, and every bridge involves 8 or a dozen stone steps to be mounted by the weary pedestrian. Besides the exercise it affords to the mountaineering muscles of the walker, the Venetian bridge subserves another useful purpose. It forms a convenient landmark. The third turn to the right after the second bridge is a typical direction to have given one. Rio means a canal, fondamenta, a paved path or quay, which sometimes runs beside a rio, where the houses do not, as is often the case, rise up sheer out of the water. Squero is a word dear to the painter's heart, for it denotes one of the most sketchable objects in this artist's paradise, the yard or shed where gondolas are sent for their periodical cleaning and repair. Here the eye has a rest from the ubiquitous stonework of palace, bridge, and pavement. The rich dark tones of wooden sheds are enforced when the squero is active by a touch of smoke and flame, backed sometimes, as in the favourite squero of San Trovaso, by a refreshing mass of green bushes. The names of the calli are often very quaint, and sometimes unintelligible. More often than not they record either the name of a great family of the neighbourhood, or of an art or trade once practised there. Calle de Magasin is a frequently recurring title, which, however, gives us no more definite information than that there was at some time or another a shop in the Calle. More specific in their teaching are names like Calle del Pestrin, of the dairyman; del Remer, of the oar-maker; della Malvasia, of the shop where imported wines were sold; del Frutarol, of the fruit-seller; del Cafetier, of the coffee-house keeper; del Forner, of the baker; del Becher, of the butcher, and so on. At least two of the busiest Venetian streets, the Merceria and the Frezzaria, are without the surname Calle or its equivalent. The former explains itself, the latter means a place where arrows were made. Sometimes the name points to a characteristic of the street itself. Calle Larga and Calle Lunga, like Merceria, explain themselves sufficiently, and so almost does Calle Crosera, which simply means cross street. Similarly, Ponte Storta, crooked bridge, is the name for a bridge which crosses the canal diagonally. Now and again a more picturesque memory is enshrined in the title, as in the case of Ponte della Guerra, Bridge of the Battle, and Ponte dei Pugni, Bridge of the Fisticuffs, both of which were scenes of the annual contests which took place all through the Middle Ages and down to the 18th century between the Castellani in the east of the city and the Nicelotti of the west. Hearty faction fights, which not seldom resulted in fatalities, but were sometimes tolerated, sometimes actually approved by the authorities. Calle del Traghetto is a name which combines ornament with usefulness, for it enables the stranger to advance with confidence, sure that if he strikes green water at the other end he will find also the means of crossing it, and not be forced to retrace his steps under a fire of juvenile criticism. Ruga, cf. French rue, is a calle that was lined with shops on either hand. Ramo is a name that frequently appears. It is applied to a branch or small offshoot of a larger calle. Salizzada, which simply means a pavement or paved place, records the fact that the usually rather broad calle so named was once the principal street in its parish, and so achieved the dignity of a paved condition in the remote ages when the rest of Venice was in a state more easily imagined than described. One other term demands a place in our working vocabulary, piscina, which implies that the little open space so designated is not just a campiello or small square, but the site of an old fish pond. Certain routes which form the arteries of Venetian life and movement, like the Merceria, Venice's Bond Street, which leads from the Piazza to the neighbourhood of the Rialto, or the vastly more complicated route which conducts you, if you can trace it, from the Accademia to the railway station, are quite busy thoroughfares, especially at certain times of day. Some of the most frequented thoroughfares, like the Via Vittorio Emanuele and the Calle Larga 22 Marzo, March 22nd, 1848, both commemorating in their names the struggle for Italian liberty, have been widened to meet the necessities of modern traffic, but in the rest a motley stream of good-natured humanity jostles itself amiably at exceedingly close quarters, while the few individuals whose business carries them in the unfashionable direction have as much as they can do to make any headway. Many of the Venetian churches and other points of interest are most conveniently visited on foot. Indeed, the visitor who shirks walking will almost certainly remain ignorant of some of the things most worth seeing. Such are the beautiful little campo and church of San Aponal, St. Apollinaris, with its precious bit of sculpture from the demolished church of Santa Elena; Santa Maria Mater Domini; Santa Andrea, with its typical campo, recalling the old days when these campi had a right to the name of meadows, and other spots, too numerous for mention, some of which cannot be very comfortably approached in gondola, while others gain in the dramatic force of their impressiveness when approached on foot. Then there are recognized promenades, where gentle exercise can be combined with the joy of a sun bath and the edification of a little sight-seeing if desired. The famous Riva degli Schiavoni, commonly called for short the Riva, is the noblest and most popular of these promenades. As you walk along it, you have the continuous prospect of the Bacino di San Marco with its shipping, the fine group of the Custom House and Church of the Salute in the middle distance to one side, and in the background the long line of the Giudecca, the island of San Giorgio Maggiore in the centre, with its striking outline of church and convent buildings, and at the other extreme a distant view of the Lido, Venice's natural breakwater, and its attendant islands. On its landward side, meanwhile, the Riva gives access directly or through side passages to numberless points of interest: the church of San Zaccaria, the small chapel of the Sclavonian fraternity, adorned with Carpaccio's masterpieces, the Greek church with its leaning tower, the old granaries of the Republic abutting on the Riva itself, now converted by a compassionate city to serve as a nightly shelter for the homeless poor, and above all the famous Arsenal with Grecian lions on its portal, the busy scene, as Dante records, of Venice's shipbuilding in the days of her naval greatness. A longer walk in the same direction will bring the pedestrian to the public gardens, one of the few beneficent traces of Napoleon's domination, a green refuge from the desert of stone, brick and water, or to the church of San Pietro in Castello, till Napoleon's day the cathedral, at the easternmost point of the city. Beyond the public gardens again, an open breezy meadow walk is offered by the adjacent island of Santa Elena. The Zattere is another delightful promenade, radiant with sunshine on a frosty winter's day, resplendent with sunset glow on any fine evening. The Venetian sunset should be viewed by everyone from the Zattere on foot, and from the Bacino and different parts of the lagoon in gondola. Facing the Zattere on the other side of the wide Giudecca Canal is another long promenade, running practically the whole length of the island of that name. This fondamenta does not attract the general run of visitors, partly because, facing north, it lies for a large part of the day in the shade, a recommendation surely on a hot sultry day, and partly because its buildings are mean and squalid compared with those on the other side of the water. English visitors are apt to confine their attention to the important church of the Redentore, and to the altogether charming little English hospital, Ospedale Cosmopolitano, close by, where they are sure of a warm English welcome from the matron and her efficient staff. But if it were only for the long straight sprint it offers in a city of narrow lanes with countless turns, this fondamenta of the Giudecca would appeal to the Englishman whose constitutional is almost a part of his creed. The promenade affords, moreover, a most varied and comprehensive view, both of the shipping which crowds more and more thickly every year into the Giudecca Canal, and of the heart of Venice on the other bank. Nor is the view of the lagoon from the far side of the island to be despised. The little terrace on the roof of the English hospital forms a magnificent point of vantage. To the east, just across the narrow Rio della Croce, it is flanked by the refreshing green mass of Mr. Eden's spacious garden, with its endless rows of lilies and bowers of roses. To the north, the outline of the Redentore church leads the eye on to an extended and general view of Venice, while southwards and westward moor gardens shape themselves into a foreground for the loveliest and dreamiest vista of outspread water and magic floating islands, backed by the far-off mountains of Padua, too coy to show themselves except just now and again. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Things Seen in Venice, by Lonsdale and Laura Ragg. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Lagoon. Venice has been styled the gem of the Adriatic. The lagoon is the beautiful setting to this jewel. Without the lagoon, indeed, Venice could not exist at all. Its ruin would begin speedily on the first stormy day, for the lagoon, with its long fringe of Lido islands and its 5 porti, or openings which admit a regular ebb and flow of tide, protects the city at once from the boisterous Adriatic and from the internal perils of stagnation and malaria. In earlier days defence was needed also from the assaults of human foes, and this is amply provided by the treacherous sandbanks which guard the openings on the seaward side, and the intricate system of mudbanks which the inrush and outflowing of the tide has formed within. Someone has said of Nature that while she works like a machine, she sleeps all the while like a picture. This is pre eminently true of the Venetian lagoon. All day long she is hard at work, cleansing by means of her tidal movements the waterways of the thickly populated city, chasing away unimaginable perils of deadly disease by her unfailing sanitary activity. Morning, noon, and night she looks so serenely fair that the enchanted gazer might be tempted to believe that her one purpose in life was to look beautiful. No one who desires to understand the inner character and working of this vast sheet of water, the product of the interaction of the sea, the Lido Islands, and the rivers, should fail to read the first chapter of Mr. Horatio Brown's Life on the Lagoons. There he will find expressed in charming language, by one who has made the lagoon his home, the inner truth of the matter. The expanse of protected water, estimated, says Mr. Horatio Brown, to cover a surface of no less than 160 geographical miles, contains numberless points of interest. There are not a few islands specially worth visiting for their picturesqueness or for their historical associations. To the north and east of Venice proper there spreads out a long train of islands, of which the first is San Michele, the cemetery, and the last, Torcello, with its very ancient Basilica, once the mother church of Venice. Between these lie Murano and Burano. The former is the seat of the famous glass-making industry for which Venice was celebrated in the Middle Ages, and is celebrated again to-day. Famous, too, for its glorious church of Santi Maria and Donato, and for the fine Bellini picture which adorns the other church of St. Peter Martyr. The latter is a miniature Venice, in which the march of civilization has not produced such deplorable results as those which mark the more beaten tracks of the tourist. Here you shall find, besides and in spite of the lace-making industry, a people, I will not say absolutely unsophisticated and unspoiled, but at any rate more ready to wear characteristic costumes, and less aggressive in the art of touting. Of Torcello everyone should read Ruskin's glowing account in The Stones of Venice. Everyone who is not hindered by physical infirmity should ascend the old Lombardic campanile, and drink in the incomparable view it offers of the far-stretching lagoon and distant Venice. Far as the eye can reach, a waste of wild sea-moor, of a lurid ashen grey, not like our northern moors with their jet-black pools and purple heath, but lifeless, the colour of sackcloth. No gathering of fantastic mists, nor coursing of clouds across it, but melancholy clearness of space in the warm sunset, oppressive, reaching to the horizon of its level gloom. To the very horizon on the north-east, but to the north and west, there is a blue line of higher land along the border of it, and above this, but farther back, a misty band of mountains touched with snow. To the east the paleness and roar of the Adriatic, to the south the widening branches of the calm lagoon, alternately purple and pale green. Beyond the widening branches of the lagoon, and rising out of the bright lake into which they gather, there are a multitude of towers, dark and scattered among square-set shapes of clustered palaces, a long irregular line fretting the southern sky. Mother and daughter, you behold them both in their widowhood, Torcello and Venice. Torcello one sees at one's feet, a group of 4 buildings, 2 of them a little larger than cottages. The interior of the larger church is strangely impressive, both in its antique arrangements and in its solemn mosaics, while the small chapel of Santa Fosca near by is in its way a perfect architectural gem. Eastward of this line of islands, north-east of Murano, and almost due south of Torcello, not far from the Litorale di Sant'Erasmo, which forms the breakwater of the lagoon on the north of the port of Lido, lies the extremely picturesque island of San Francesco del Diserto, where a still existing Franciscan monastery marks the traditional spot where the great founder of the Order spent some time in solitary and penitential meditation. Wonderful is the prospect of this northern lagoon from the Fondamente Nuove, best of all perhaps near the Sacco della Misericordia, with its piles of logs backed by the lonely and mysterious Casa degli Spiriti, whose Anglo-Saxon owner has meritoriously restored to its pristine beauty the neighbouring Contarini garden. To the west, on the side where the long railway viaduct spans the lagoon, a number of small islets lie dotted about, apparently floating upon the surface of the water — pleasant spots these for a fine day's picnic. Prominent among the islands of the eastern lagoon is San Giorgio in Alga (St. George of the Seaweed), and though its present day use as a powder magazine renders the shore of this historic isle a forbidden land, its picturesqueness and the lingering charm of its former human interest still invite the lover of beauty to moor his gondola close under its shadow. Of its ancient glory, however, there remains little but a fine old wall, from which the figure of the Madonna of the Parasol, quaint and graceful, if of small artistic value, watches the passing of the new fangled vaporini and the old-fashioned fishing boats. At the beginning of the 15th century this island belonged to a congregation of canons, one of whom was a famous Venetian bishop, St. Lorenzo Giustiniani. The conventual buildings, with their garniture of fine pictures and their famous library, were all destroyed by fire in the early years of the 18th century, when the property had passed into the hands of the Carmelites. The railway viaduct itself, so prominent a feature of this western lagoon, acquires a certain dignity from its sheer length — 2.5 miles of uniform arcading, broken only here and there where a tiny island has been pressed into the service of the engineer's art. Nor should its utilitarian and commonplace associations obscure for us its memories of heroism and pathos. This bridge was the scene of many a doughty deed in the days of the great siege of 1849, when for 5 months the city, under her last Doge, Daniele Manin, stood out single-handed against the power of Austria, only to capitulate when, in the burning heat of August, the horrors of cholera had been added to those of famine and bombardment. The bridge itself bears testimony to its glorious past in the monument erected to Agostino Steffani, whose story is surely one of the most pathetic on record. During the siege the Venetians laid a mine to blow up the railway bridge some distance from the city. For some reason or other the mine did not explode. Agostino then came forward and volunteered to row off in his Sandolo and set the matter right. General Cosenz accepted the noble offer, and the young man set forth, in face of a double fire, from Malghera and from San Giuliano. He reached the place unscathed, and accomplished his work, but had scarcely turned his prow homewards when an Austrian cannon shot sunk his little boat under him. To swim ashore was no light task, for the current was against him, but the sense of achievement and the inspiration of an anticipated hero's welcome gave him courage, and just as his strength was exhausted a passing Venetian patrol boat picked him up. Alas, his rescuers mistook the speechless man for an Austrian spy, and an excited crowd on the bank began to shower stones upon the boat, which was thought to contain such an object of execration. The people on the boat then actually threw the poor fellow back into the water, and he was overwhelmed with blows of oars and stones ere General Cosenz could come up to identify and rescue him. On this western side of Venice the manifold connection with the mainland is effected not only by railway. The all-important water supply, l'Acquedotto, finds its way along the bed of the western lagoon, and in this direction lie the 2 steamer routes to the mainland which still compete with the Ferrovia. One can go from the Riva or from the Zattere by steamer past San Giorgio in Alga to Fusina, or from near the Rialto up the Grand Canal and the Cannareggio to Mestre along the northern side of the railway bridge. On a fine day the trip to Mestre, whether taken by steamer or more leisurely and luxuriously in gondola, afford splendid views of the mountains of the Cadore, whose snow-capped peaks form a lovely background to the vast expanse of water. A trip to Fusina is also well worth while, the more as this little port on the mouth of the Brenta gives access to a light railway which follows that river's windings past a quaint series of villas and villages as far as Padua, from which point, if time presses, the return journey may be made by express train to Venice. To the south of Venice the lagoon stretches out for many a mile, till the extreme point is reached at Brandolo, just beyond Chioggia. To the east extends the long reef of defence against the Adriatic, the Lido, the Litorale of Malamocco, and that of Chioggia, a rampart broken in two places, at the port of Malamocco and at that of Chioggia. Along the western side of this portion of the lagoon stretches the low-lying coast, fringed by the Laguna Morta, or Dead Lagoon, with its salt marshes and semi-stagnant pools. Islands are dotted here and there in this expanse of protected water between the Lido rampart and the salt marshes of the Laguna Morta, streaming off from the central group which constitutes Venice proper in ever-diminishing density, as though they had been flung athwart the lagoon by a giant hand. San Servolo and La Grazia, comparatively near to the Giudecca island, and to San Giorgio Maggiore, San Clemente, the Manicomio or madhouse, and San Lazzaro, with the convent of the genial and hospitable Armenian Uniat Fathers a little further off. And then, in a far scattered line, Santa Spirito, Poveglia, and San Pietro in Volta. In old days practically all the islands of the lagoon were inhabited, each being the property of a separate conventual body. We may picture the great waste of waters dotted with little centres of culture, praise, and intercession. The majority of them have now lost the main part of their buildings. The well-kept garden has disappeared, and the church adorned with its treasures and sometimes valuable pictures. The islands themselves remain, and, seen from a distance or from near by, with the picturesque outlines of the buildings which adorn most of them, they are of immense value in the landscape, furnishing a foreground or a middle distance, giving interest to what would otherwise be, with all its beauty, an unrelieved expanse of watery flatness, and aiding the eye in its instinctive search for a guide to perspective in the bewildering vastness of the lagoon. Some of them are still well worth a visit for their intrinsic interest. Each of them adds something to the indescribable charm of the prospect westward across the shining waters towards the distant Euganean hills. But for most visitors the long rampart of the Lido Islands is more conspicuously attractive than its attendant islets. The name Lido — it is simply the Latin litus, coast — is more especially applied to the part of this rampart that lies nearest to Venice. Once it was a picturesque, bare strand of hillocks, heaped from ever-shifting sand, matted with thistles and amphibious weeds, an uninhabited seaside where it was exhilarating to ride and walk. Now, quantum mutatus ab illo, it is a fashionable, commonplace bathing resort, crammed in the summer with bathers, herded in monster hotels, or lodged in frightful little mushroom villas. These monstrous growths have something of the sinister gaiety of the fungus race. The villas are apt to be decorated, and sometimes, alas, to be constructed, in the style of the new art, while the bathers who inhabit them are dressed according to the dernier cri of Rome and Paris. The shore, too thickly studded with amorphous bathing huts, is extremely ugly, till the shades of evening have converted them all into flat grey shadows, seen against a sky still bright with the afterglow of sunset. Nothing, however, can destroy the view landwards from the Lido, a view happily to be enjoyed from many points, but perhaps, best of all, by a strange irony, from the terrace of that colossus of a new hotel in which the spirit of Art Nouveau is personified. In early summer mornings, or on fine still evenings, this view over Venice is of magical and unearthly loveliness. San Nicolo del Lido stands at the north end of this island, in a truly delightful spot, where the greenest grass within miles of Venice supplies the city's one great defect, where wide green meadows are bounded by a hedge, where the blackthorn blossoms, and watered by lazy flowing watercourses that counterfeit an English stream, while the path that leads from the meadows is flanked by poplar trees, and is deep and cool as an English lane. The church is dedicated to St. Nicholas of Bari, of whom the mariners of old Venice always craved a blessing when they put to sea, and when they returned home, laden or not, as the case might be, with the spoils of the East. It is still worth a visit, if only for its historical associations, but to the English pilgrim the military fortress has a peculiar attraction, if he succeeds in obtaining leave to penetrate within its lines. For here are the tombstones of a little group of Englishmen, not very illustrious nor very obscure in themselves, but evoking a feeling of real pathos by reason of the lonely and inaccessible nature of their resting place, from which a determined effort was made a few years ago to obtain leave to remove the remains and have them interred in consecrated ground. But the combined efforts of English and German promoters of this movement — for there are German tombs also at San Nicolo — failed to penetrate the cordon of red tape, though permission for a special visit was acceded on terms known only to the English chaplain and the English consul. These foreign residents of a former century, among whom are Sir Francis Vincent, a scion of the house of Sackville, and a certain Consul Smith, to whom Windsor Castle owes not a few of its art treasures, were interred in unconsecrated ground before a section of the present cemetery was set apart for the burial of the Acattolici, as the local authorities compactly describe all believers in any or no creed who reject the jurisdiction of the Roman Pontiff. Southwards from San Nicolo, the long narrow island stretches past the fashionable bathing area and the monster hotels into a region of solitude little altered from that congenial waste in which Byron and Shelley rode together. Here the keen pedestrian may indeed stretch his legs. Splendid air and splendid views of the lagoon and distant Venice, and the still more distant mountains on the one side, and the purple Adriatic on the other, lure him on past Malamocco, till, at the fort of Alberoni, he is brought to a halt, where the opening of Porto di Malamocco interrupts the continuity of the natural breakwater, nearly half-way to Chioggia. Chioggia itself he must approach by steamer, and a fine day's trip it is, bright with the gorgeous colouring of the sails of the fishing boats, which in high noon strive to equal in brilliance the sunset-tinted vapours in which Venice will be seen swathed on the return journey. The call at Malamocco and Pellestrina, which the boat makes on the way, gives the visitor a glimpse and a foretaste of the characteristic picturesqueness of the ancient fishing port of Chioggia, so memorable in history, yet above all acceptable to the jaded sightseer to-day because he is on holiday and means to give himself for a few hours at least to lazy contemplation of outside things, form and colour and human nature. As one traverses the wide spaces of the lagoon, the eye is not so incessantly distracted towards swiftly passing objects of interest. It has leisure, at last, to rest upon the delightful and indeed unique means of transport which will always be inseparably associated with the lagoon in the visitor's memory. The gondola is apt to be taken for granted after the initial pleasure and surprise of introduction, but it merits study. In the first place, it is an essentially Venetian boat, the child of the lagoon, gradually evolved in the course of ages by successive stages, many of which can still be traced. It is the lineal descendant of the light skiff which Cassiodorus, secretary of Theodoric, saw tied to the doors of the rude Venetian dwellings of the early 6th century. These skiffs probably resemble most nearly the little boat now called barchetta, and Mr. Horatio Brown, in the volume already referred to, has traced the gradual evolution of the perfect gondola of to-day from this rudimentary barchetta form. Visitors to the Accademia will observe in the Venetian scenes by Bellini and Carpaccio a middle stage in this development depicted. the early 16th century gondola resembles the modern one in many points, but it lacks the ferro, the picturesque polished iron beak which gives it much of its swan-like quality. The felze, the little wooden house in which the gondola passengers are enclosed when protection from the outer elements or from human gaze is desired, is itself the outcome of a long process of evolution. At one time it was made a subject of excessive display, and many sumptuary laws were passed to restrain the extravagances of wealthy citizens. The government found it very difficult to enforce the regulation that every felze was to be covered only with coarse black cloth, but they persevered, only relaxing the law in favour of foreign ambassadors, with the funereal result that is visible in the felze of to day. By the middle of the 18th century the gondola of contemporary pictures was like the present one, long for speed, with one ferro hatchet-shaped, and a black felze with door and windows. Besides its metals, iron, steel, and brass, sometimes as many as 5 different kinds of wood enter into the composition of the gondola — walnut, cherry, elm, pine, and oak, not counting the beech wood of the oars — and every piece is most carefully selected. It must be well seasoned and without knots. When the boat is finished it is a joy to look upon, as well as a luxury to sit in, but its graceful lines are not without a certain subtle want of symmetry. Nor is this unsymmetrical build the product of happy-go-lucky methods, such as seem to belong to certain types of Italian work. On the contrary, it is carefully and deliberately planned. The boat is without helm. It is to be guided and propelled by a single oar, and that in face of wind and tide. It must be ready to respond to the slightest motion of its oarsmen, to advance in a straight line, to negotiate any angle, to spin round, if required, on its own axis. It is built with a perceptible list to one side, to balance the weight of him who stands on its poop, and to counteract the bias of his one oar's impetus it is built with one side longer and more curved than the other. The result is the Swan of the Lagoon, the most graceful and the most comfortable carriage that can be conceived. End of chapter 5.